How do you deal with shame? How do we process it? How do we experience it? How do we release it? Where does shame come from? Is it really even our burden? These are some of the questions that I've been asking myself for a while as reflecting back on my life. I've experienced so much shame all the way from childhood to adulthood. And the shame has developed from various situations, right? Various traumas, experiences. And I was just recently looking at pictures of myself, and I think these pictures were taken in 2024, so not that long ago. And what I noticed is that I was really impressed. Like, I was looking at these pictures of myself and I was like, wow, like I don't look bad. I look pretty. And I was looking at my body and just assessing them and really surprised. And this was surprising because at the time when I had taken the pictures, when my friend had taken the pictures of me, I didn't even want to look at them. I took a quick glance at them and I felt like this deep weight of shame. I was embarrassed of my body, my curves, always feeling fat. And yeah, am I at my ideal weight now? Not really. And my weight's been fluctuating, and it has been a struggle for me, and that's something I've been working with. And what I noticed though, once I started to go down this journey and I began reflecting, I realized that it didn't matter that like what weight I was at, but this is a way that I've always looked at myself. So even in high school, like really thin, 120 pounds, like I was an athlete, so I was very active. I would shame myself. I wasn't skinny enough. I wasn't pretty enough, and always thought I was fat. And then over the years, as my body developed and became more curvaceous and more feminine, I would continue that pattern. And so every time for most of my life, regardless of what I actually looked like, I would look through the eyes of shame, and I was in like almost contempt for myself. Really harshly, I would see myself through the lens of somebody who just didn't like myself. And I was so hard on myself. And so now, where I'm at today, looking back on some of these pictures of myself and these moments of my life through my inner journey, my inner memory and recall, right? I'm recognizing just how difficult I've made it for myself. So where do these patterns come from? How did I develop this ability to deeply shame myself, to the point where it's like once far removed with time? I look back at pictures of myself from before my son, and I'm like, wow, I was so beautiful. Like, I had such a great body. But during that time when those pictures were taken, I didn't feel beautiful. I didn't feel good about my body. I didn't like my body. I didn't have a positive relationship with my physical appearance at all. And so I would constantly shame myself. So where does this pattern come from? How did this develop? When did this experience begin for me? So as I began asking myself these questions, and inner child work, of course, played a major role in this, I started to recognize that some of the shame that I've been carrying and what I've been reflecting on for myself didn't necessarily kind of come from me. So some of the shame that I carry was kind of handed down to me from my parents, from my environment, right? And I noticed that, and of course there's like somebody who's a psychologist, and especially a child psychologist, can speak better on this, so excuse me. But as children, it's difficult for us to form our own beliefs, right? We look outside of us for validation. So when we're being treated and abused or neglected, or emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse from our caregivers, instead of having the ability to recognize that there's something wrong with this person, like this is a tortured person, or there's something not right about them. Or instead, what happened to me and in my experience is I was reflecting on myself. I saw myself as the problem. Especially for people who experience, this is kind of a trigger warning, I guess, trigger warning, S letter X abuse. Shame is really, really common. And this can show up in so many ways, especially with body image and taking care of yourself after the event and cleaning yourself up and making sure nobody notices and just being hyper attuned to that and hyper attuned to your body. But what I really want to get into is that my inability, because as a child, and I think I'm going to guess this is true for most children, that the heart and the soul is just so pure. So I know there's a whole like mind and psychological and personality and development part of this as well. But spiritually speaking, and through my own experience with my own inner journey, I found that instead of recognizing and being able to say like, wow, like, so and so did this is something on them, what I did do was reflect on myself, and I carried that shame, like, why am I not good enough? Why don't they love me? Or why don't they want to spend time with me? Why do they hurt me? Why am I in trouble? Why am I a bad girl? Why does this keep happening? And it's not even, I don't even know if why was even the question, but instead it was just like, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy of love. And that is a really heavy experience, right? So this is kind of where I was developing the weight of shame, the personality, the persona, the belief system, the perspective of looking at myself through the eyes of shame. And a couple of things that I would like to share, and I know they're very heavy, so if this is not something, you're in the mood for, please don't watch this. I don't want to upset anyone. But, when I was younger, I grew up, really poor. And there was just a lot of, my mom was very young. Her partners were all abusive. They all abused substances. They were physically abusive, emotionally abusive, neglectful, and we were very poor. And one of the things that I had to experience as a child is my family couldn't afford diapers. So I had a sister who was 18 months younger than me, and they couldn't afford diapers for both of us. So around the age of 2, I was pulled off of diapers, and my sister needed them because she was 18 months old. So I was like 2-3 years old, and I was bedwetting for many reasons. This happens, especially for children that experience a lot of trauma. But anyways, that's not today's video. So what I was experiencing is my family, they couldn't handle the shame, right? The parental figures, the mother and father that were raising me at that time, they couldn't, and I say that with a little disassociation because the father that raised me at that point in time wasn't even actually my father, and I didn't find out until much later in life. And then of course my mother, it's difficult, right? So she was unable to and didn't have the consciousness or the ability to protect me, right? So here it is, these parents that are like low income, low education, low consciousness, full of trauma, carrying their own generational trauma, and substance abuse in the home. So instead of them being able to recognize that, hey, we can't afford these diapers, because of this, because whatever the reason or what they needed to do, or they couldn't rise to the occasion to fix the problem, I became the scapegoat. So instead of them recognizing and dealing with the fact of the shame of not being able to afford diapers for both of their children or pull-ups, they would beat me and shame me and humiliate me for bedwetting. And, it's a really difficult thing because my son is 5, and he doesn't really have accidents anymore, very like far few in between. But at the age that was happening to me, my son was in nighttime pull-ups, and that was like normal. And so instead of me rationalizing, or even as an adult, get into later in life when I had a son, I didn't even recognize that as something as a normal bedwetting, as part of a normal part of child development, especially at that young age. But instead, what happened is I believed, I was shameful. I was ashamed that I was a bedwetter. I was hurt and I was scared, and I constantly, every time I would wake up in the morning, if I had wet the bed, I was so ashamed, and I carried that so heavily. And then their anger, their frustration, and the beatings that followed that, is something I had to carry for such a long time. So that really started to develop my inner perspective, my inner eye towards myself, my beliefs towards myself, my perspective towards myself. And I continued to carry the shame, and it started because they couldn't carry the shame of their situation. They couldn't rise to it. They experienced a shameful experience about money, poverty, or whatever the situation was for them. I don't know. And instead of rising and changing that and becoming conscious and becoming aware, they used me as their scapegoat. They took out their anger and their frustration, and then it's like they passed on that shame to me. So I hope I'm speaking clear that these things are really difficult for me to speak of. So sometimes I know that the spiral of the story can be exhausting, but this is a really powerful thing. And as I continue to grow and evolve, the shame that was constantly put on me really wasn't always mine to begin with. It's something that was passed down. And that's not to say that I've never done anything that was not a shameful act. I never did anything that was not right or whatever. That's not what this is. So while I was confronting this, and I've been dealing with this process and recognizing and releasing that. So because for me, my shame was just so deeply embedded in my personality and my experience and my consciousness and my ability to see myself in the world, that it went unnoticed for years and years and years. And as I gradually became more and more aware of this shame, my journey, my spiritual journey is what brought that awareness, right? So as I became more and more aware, I started recognizing oh, I'm shaming myself, but yet I would continue to shame myself, and then as time continued to go, I would see more and more signs of how I was, essentially self-harming myself, abusing myself emotionally, and just repeating that loop, that shame loop, over and over and over again. So while I've been working on this inner child work and releasing this shame, it's like Trevor Hall's album In and Through the Body, I can see and feel and experience it's like these triggers, these things happen, right? So for me, it was the photo, and from that photo I went down this road of shame, this path of shame. And what was revealed to me throughout what was unfolding, what was revealed and coming to light, helped me to recognize the shame that I was holding within myself. So how did I deal with all of this shame? And I know that's one story, that's a little bit when I was a little bit older, but what I found is that as I continued to go deeper and deeper, almost like the roots of a tree, we are like the sacred tree, right? So if you imagine yourself as a sacred tree, and then the roots you know, following the root. So like one of my roots, my root of shame, or my branch of shame, and just following it to as deep as I can go, as deep as I can manage, I can consciously hold space for, I can allow myself to channel the emotions for, right? Because that's a big part of it. Like, what can you hold? What can you release? What can you experience? Where are you? Like, what do you have the constitute? Because that's part of it, right? So as I'm following like this root, this shame root, and I'm following it deeper and deeper, I found myself in my mother's womb. And you know, this is kind of heavy to talk about, and I did mention this in my ayahuasca video on YouTube. And what Aya had showed me was that I was conceived from rape. So my mom was 19 when she was pregnant with me. You know, at the time, her partner was a coke dealer. You know, he was much older than her. Well, he got busted. And so him and his mother conspired with his friend to rape my mother, to impregnate her, to assist him to getting out of jail earlier, showing that he had a family and whatever, among so much more, but that will be another video. But anyway, so here my mom was, right? She's this 19-year-old girl, grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, low income, low education, very unconscious parents, extremely traumatic upbringing in a very toxic environment, you know, dating a drug dealer, and, you know, really 19, like she's still a kid, you know, and then she finds out that she's raped and she tries to abort me, tries to have an abortion. Something happens with the appointment, I don't really know, but she was unable to, right? So, and I think too, part of it is she's probably pressured to keep me. So here's this 19-year-old woman, right? Pregnant, raped, and having a baby that she doesn't want to have. Maybe she feels trapped, you know? So imagine that environment for me as a fetus, as a baby, as a developing spiritual conscious being growing in that type of environment, you know? And this could be a whole nother video about learning the path of compassion for others and releasing that. And I have a lot of work to do when it comes to my mother. And I've done a lot of work, but at the place that I'm at now, and what some teachers call the middle path, or another school of thought, neutrality is another way that they describe this, is, you know, opening myself up to seeing both perspectives, both experiences, seeing the full picture, seeing both sides of the energy, right? So it's not lost on me that my mother was suffering as a young 19-year-old, you know, in downtown Worcester, Massachusetts, right? With all of these things probably up against her. So I understand that, and I don't know how I would manage something like that, but I think that's a lot, right? So moving on from that, my first human experience in this lifetime was developing in a womb of somebody who had conflicting feelings, you know, and didn't have the capacity to process, didn't have the consciousness or the safety to grieve and release. And instead, this person, my mother, this energy, this being, you know, did the best that she could, yes, but it's keeping on hold of that. And that was the environment that I was birthed into, right? And recognizing, so while I was following my shame route and going there, what's interesting, and I will say that, so following the route of the shame for me in this lifetime, and really experiencing that, I could feel that. So I was doing a walking meditation for this exercise, and I could feel my heart space, like this sadness, almost like a dull chronic feeling and heaviness, and I could feel the disruption in my heart space. There was pain, but I will say that it wasn't the most painful shame. It wasn't the strongest shame I've experienced, but it was the first shame. And sometimes for me, when I go on these healing journeys within myself and these deep levels of self-reflection, and go through this and allow myself, and this is my process, and I choose to go through this, and I choose to allow myself to open myself as the channel to feel that, because I didn't know how to feel and express it as a baby, right? As a fetus, this being, this little innocent being growing in this toxic environment, right? What tools did I have, you know? So while I'm sitting with myself at this point in time in the womb, allowing my grown-up self, who can safely process these emotions for myself, you know, that's when my inner child work, and I'm gently speaking to myself, I will take this from you. It's okay. I love you. You're beautiful. I will take care of you. I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm with you. I love you. I love you. I love you. So going through this process is, for me, like something I need, right? It's essential. It's something that I need to develop and to go on my journey and to go through this process of healing and awareness and consciousness. Because on one side of it, yes, I could look at my mom and really have a lot of hurt feelings, which that was part of my process and has been. Or I can just take a moment and detach myself and recognize she had this. This was her shame. This was her difficulty. This was her trauma, even though I was receiving it from her. You know, even though that was the environment I was being welcomed into, I was being created into. And it's not about placing blame, but it's recognizing that what's mine is mine and what's hers is hers, and that's okay too, right? And for me, it's such an important piece to allow myself to feel these emotions, because this isn't something that I just, you know, spontaneously think of. Like, these emotions, these patterns, these energies are in our subconscious. They're running, these are the background programs that are running our lives, that's teaching us how to see the world, how to perceive ourselves, the perspectives. You know, we're seeing truth through a narrow lens, you know, a very small lens. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. You know, if you want to talk more about shame, you can always send me a message, and thank you so much for sticking around.